Okay, now that we have talked about how we get code and the different types of codes, I want to elaborate a little bit further, especially about Title 19. So, as you've seen, there are many different types of codes, many different regulations and standards that a fire inspector has to be familiar with. The different codes are going to apply in different places in different ways. So we kind of have to understand where they come from and what they apply to. So the first one I want to make sure you are clear on is the California State Fire Marshal's Code. It's called Title 19. The State Fire Marshal was mandated by the Health and Safety Code to write regulations. And these regulations guide the inspector when they are inspecting the types of facilities and the types of places that the fire inspector has been given authority over, or especially the fire marshal. So the legislature made a statute. Remember, we just talked about how we get statutes from Congress and Senate voting together, getting a unanimous vote, then it goes to the governor who signs it, and then it gets a date put on it, and it eventually becomes law. Well, the legislature made a statute in the Health and Safety Code giving the state fire marshal authority over certain kinds of occupancies, all fire protection devices, anything having to do with explosives, fireworks, hazardous materials, and decorative materials, and they gave them authority over all state-owned buildings. Now, the local fire authority can only inspect these types of facilities where the state fire marshal asks them to or allows them to. So let's look at how they got that code. Well, this is This is found in the state fire marshals, in the health and safety code. The state fire marshal was mandated by the health and safety code 13143.A, and it says exactly this. Sorry for just reading, but you need to understand this and read it as I read it out loud to you. The state fire marshal, with the advice of the State Board of Fire Services, shall prepare, adopt, we talked about what that means, and submit building standards, and shall prepare and adopt other regulations establishing minimum, that's a very important word, these are the minimum requirements for the prevention of fire and for the protection of life and property against fire and panic in any building or structure used or intended. Now here they're going to give the list of the kinds of places. Anything that's used as an asylum, a jail, a mental hospital, a regular hospital, and then they talk about, blah, 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 the different kinds of health facilities where people are incapacitated. That's the important part of that. Then they say any school or similar occupancy of any capacity, and in any assembly occupancy where 50 or more people gather together in a building. So this is kind of the definition of an assembly. 50 or more where people gather in a room or structure for the purpose of amusement, entertainment, instruction, deliberation, worship, drinking or dining, awaiting transportation or education, and then for any laboratory or research and development facility that stores, handles, or uses regulated hazardous materials. There's one that I didn't see in here, camps. Camps also apply, and that might have been in a later version of this code. I want you to notice, though, occupancy. I'm sorry, assembly occupancy. So if it's somewhere where you watch a movie, that's entertainment, or go to a concert. If it's somewhere where you get training and it's 50 or more people, if it's a place where you worship, a church, 50 or more people, any restaurant. So think about the In-N-Out that you like to go to, or the Starbucks. Is it 50 or more? Then it's an assembly. If it's 49 or less, then it's just considered a business and it's not under the state fire marshal's authority. So we'll talk about that next week. So the result of the Health and Safety Code mandating the state fire marshal to make these code of regulations, they put together what is called Title 19. It's not as thick or as it doesn't go into as much detail as the fire code goes into, the California Fire Code, because it's got a narrower scope. It applies to fewer things. So whereas the California Fire Code is in a 3-inch wide binder, the State Fire Marshal Code is in like a 1-inch wide binder. And if we were in person in this class, I always show everyone the difference between the two. Now, what's the purpose of the State Fire Marshal's Code of Regulations? Well, they've been prepared and adopted for the purpose of establishing minimum standards for the protection of fire and for the protection of life and property against fire, explosion, and panic. That's its purpose, and it says that right in the beginning of the code. Where does it apply? Well, does it apply everywhere? It applies to the things that we talked about. But what if there are local ordinances that maybe don't exactly say the exact same thing as the state fire marshal's code? Is that allowed? Well, like we learned in the last lecture, things can get stricter, but they can never get more lenient when we're going from either federal to state or state to local. So here's what it says in the code. Nothing contained in these regulations shall be considered as abrogating. Now, why'd they use a big word like that? None of us know what that means. I had to look it up in a dictionary. It means to negate or to make it null and void. They're not trying to make the local rules go away. They're not saying that they're irrelevant under this one condition. So they're not abrogating the provisions of any ordinance, rule, or regulation of any city, city and county, or county governmental agency, providing, very important, such local ordinance, rule, or regulation is not less stringent than these minimum standards. So, in other words, local governments like Ventura or LA City or LA County or whoever, they can make laws that are different than the state fire marshal, but they can only be stricter, never more lenient. In other words, in the local government, we can't just say, well, we're not going to enforce that rule here. That's kind of a controversial subject right now because some states and cities are saying they're not going to enforce the federal laws that have been being handed down over the last couple of years. Yeah, that's kind of led to a civil war the last time that happened. So we got to watch out. Hopefully we don't have another civil war, but local governments are obligated to follow the rules set forth by the higher up governments like state and federal. So, no local ordinance also can be applicable in any of the following, though. You can have stricter rules, but when it comes to public schools, you can't enforce it there. The public schools are only the only laws that apply to them are the ones the state fire marshal says are the right codes and the right regulations. And the same applies in state-owned buildings or state-occupied buildings. The same applies in community care facilities and organized camps. Now, state-owned or state-occupied buildings, they might let you come in and do an inspection or do a pre-plan, but don't expect them to change things based on our rules. That's especially true at a federal level. You can go and ask the FBI down in Westwood if you can bring your fire crew in to do a pre-plan. They're probably going to say, no way, Jose, you're not coming in here. But even if they do let you in, they won't allow you to enforce any local laws there. They're under the federal government and they follow their own rules. It's it's kind of it's a little sketchy because they have their own set of rules and they enforce it. It's kind of like putting one of the kids in charge of the other kids. Things aren't always going to go the way that maybe the adults think it should go, but when the government is enforcing its laws and overseeing the government, they do whatever they want to do. So don't mess with them, though. They're the federal government, and they've got like big guns and lots of power and lots of people that do their bidding. So I wouldn't mess with that. But that's the way it works. Now, what if somebody violates these rules? Well, the state fire marshal tells us what to do about it. Any person who violates any regulation contained in this subchapter shall be considered in violation of the statutes under which these regulations have been adopted. In most instances, the application of regulations to existing occupancies will necessitate the granting of sufficient time to effect the necessary change. In other words, firefighters rarely write someone a ticket or some kind of a fine. What we do is we give them a notice to improve the situation. It's a notice. It's basically like a fix-it ticket, but anybody who's had a fix-it ticket knows that not only do they have to fix it, but they also have to pay a fine. In this case, they don't have to pay a fine unless they don't fix it. Well, guess what? If they don't fix it and we come back after 2 weeks, we'll give them another week. Yeah, we really want to get compliance. It's not about trying to fine people. Now, we can fine, and more departments are fining and charging people per fine when they do their inspections, but that's not always the case, and it's not necessarily the case. So we're going to give them time to improve the situation and fix it. If they don't, then we will, at that time, possibly have a meeting with the district attorney and them, or we might fine them at that point and write a ticket and fine them. Lastly, who enforces these regulations? Guess what? The provisions of the State Fire Marshal Code, Title 19, shall be enforced by the State Fire Marshal and all of his or her deputies, but also the chief of any city or county fire department or fire protection district, and bold, underlined, I think you better pay attention to this, their authorized representatives. in their respective areas or jurisdiction. Who's the authorized representatives? Well, that's every sworn officer or firefighter who wears a badge. So when you swear, you raise your right hand and you've given a badge and you make an oath that you will enforce the fire code and the laws of the government that you're representing, and that you will do your duty as a firefighter, then that power or authority comes down on you when you're on the job, right? You are, when you are on duty and you're wearing that badge, you are deemed a sworn officer or an authorized representative. That's when you can enforce the code. Yeah, I know a guy that he got fired from LA County Fire Department. He went out one day off duty in uniform with a clipboard, pretending he was doing a fire inspection at a business called Answer Products. Any of the motorcycle riders in this class might recognize that name. They make products for motocross and motorcycle riders. And he was trying to get some freebies and pretended to be on duty, pretended to be doing an inspection. And guess what? From the moment he went off duty, doesn't matter if you're wearing the badge, if you're wearing the uniform, you have no authority behind you. It is only when you are on duty. That's when you are an authorized representative. So don't mess with that kind of stuff. He ended up getting fired um, for that and many other things that he did. But know that when you're out there on the job, you need to enforce Title 19 where it applies. And we'll talk about it more as this semester goes on.